All right, so we're going to do our last set of notes for the school year. We're going to look at the conferences that happened during World War II, and then the conferences that they used in order to figure out what the world's going to look like after World War II, and how this leads us into the Cold War. So I'm going to move to the next slide. So, Casablanca. This conference was in January 1943, and as we see here, only President Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill met at Casablanca. And here they decided that for all enemies, it needs to be unconditional surrender. We're not going to have anyone questioning at the end of this war whether or not they lost, like Germany did at the end of World War One. So this time around, it is all or nothing. They had already met in Cairo with Jiang Jieshi, the leader of the national government in China, and they had already worked out with him what Asia is going to look like at the end of the war and the role that China is going to play. And one of the things that they did discuss is it had to be unconditional surrender. So Roosevelt and Churchill are again adamant it has to be unconditional surrender. They also make the decision that the first invasion they're going to do will be in Italy. And actually, for the United States, this was a smart move. Our troops were not ready to go into France and attack the German troops. We would have been destroyed. I mean, we had a rough time in Italy when we first got there, but Italy was, going into Northern Africa and then into Italy, it was the smarter move for us. Now, for Stalin, this was something that he was irritated about because he really wanted and needed for Great Britain and the United States to open up that second front in France. And that would alleviate a lot of the issues that they were dealing with in the Soviet Union with the German attack. Now, Stalin felt that they purposely chose Italy over going into France because he felt that they were choosing Italy over the Soviet Union to allow more Soviets to die. In a way, there were some that believed that Russia deserved what they were getting. For one, they bailed on the Allies at the end of World War I. And two, Stalin had made that Soviet non-aggression pact early on in 1939, which said that the Germans and the Russians wouldn't attack each other. Well, it turned out Hitler lied, and he ended up attacking the Soviet Union. So for Stalin, he thought, yeah, you guys are just trying to make it a little rougher on me. And there was a little evidence that, yeah, maybe they were. But for the United States, this was a war that we were going into in Europe that had nothing to do with us. Our beef was with Japan. So for Roosevelt, the fact that we're sending our troops over to fight someone else's enemy, which was Germany, we were going to have to deal with body bags and how many body bags were going to be sent home. He had to be very careful. So for Roosevelt, he's going to have to keep Churchill in line, and he's going to have to try to figure out how to keep Stalin in line because he has to answer to the American people. So Italy is going to be our first invasion point. And then later on, they will focus on when to open up that front in France. And that, as you know, through Mr. Pearson's notes, happened to be D-Day. So let's move on to our next conference, which is the Moscow Conference. Now, this was in 1943, and the discussion happened that the Soviet Union agreed that, yes, they will join against Japan after Germany is defeated. So that's the deal. Everything has to be taken care of in Europe first with Germany, and then they would help us with Japan and Asia. Stalin also agrees to participate in a world organization. And as you recall with the Atlantic Charter, back with some earlier notes with Mr. Pearson, FDR and Churchill had met and they had hashed out the Atlantic Charter, which was pretty much what Woodrow Wilson had presented with his 14 points. It's just this time around, it was agreeable because it was the United States and Great Britain coming together with those ideas. Self-determination, free trade, allowing for free elections in countries. Oh, I know, let's not take the land that we're actually freeing from German occupation. And let's create an international organization that could deal with peace, that could deal with humanitarian efforts, that could actually send troops in if someone needs to be stopped with whatever actions they were doing. So that is where they decided the United Nations would replace what the League of Nations should have been doing. Stalin agrees that yes, he would participate in such an organization. He agreed to do so in 1943. Moving on to Tehran. And Tehran, it's as we see here with the dates in 1943, we're looking at November 28th through December 1st. This will be the first time that the big three, all three representatives from the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union meet together. So Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. So we definitely have some big egos coming to Tehran. And we look here, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt all have a different agenda. Stalin agrees, yes, I have made the commitment. I will enter the war against Japan. After Germany's defeated, yes, I will be there. My troops will be there to assist. However, he wants to address what's going to happen in Eastern Europe. He insists all the land in Eastern Europe that they are pretty much liberating from German occupation needs to fall under Soviet control. Stalin wants a buffer. He needs a buffer between the Soviet Union and Germany. Germany has been an aggressor in two major wars, and he wants to control Eastern Europe to prevent any more damage being done to the Soviet Union. He also believes that by controlling Eastern Europe, that will establish governments and economic systems that are friendly toward what the Soviet Union has, because democracy and capitalism are not the friends of communism and totalitarian regimes. He also insists that Germany has to be carved up. Germany must be weakened and never allowed to build her strength again. That when you look at World War I, Germany was given an opportunity to rebuild because of everyone's fear of the spread of communism. That cannot happen, according to Stalin. Germany must be crushed and never allowed to become a unified nation. Churchill on the other side was like, absolutely not. There has to be free elections in Eastern Europe. Give the people an opportunity. Allow them to decide. Because if you allow people to decide, they're not going to choose what you want, a communist totalitarian regime. And Churchill also understands in order to get the economy and trade flowing back through Europe, Germany has to be a strong country. And he also sees the significance of having a strong Germany, which could stop the spread of that communism coming from the Soviet Union. Now, for Roosevelt, he's pretty much in the middle. He has to be the mediator. He understands part of the issue that Stalin is seeing with Eastern Europe. It's a little hard to say, no, Stalin, you can't have the land that you're liberating, when he knows that Great Britain is actually confiscating land in the Mediterranean that they have been liberating. And they're also looking at some things in Asia that they could get a hold of too. So how can you say yes to one and no to the other? And he believes that, you know what, let's just work on the United Nations. Sounds a little bit like Wilson and his whole League of Nations. And once this organization is together, then we'll be able to hash out some of these differences. Plus, this is just the first meeting that the big three have met. We have two more meetings to get through. So let's move to our next one. But before we get to our next conference, Churchill and Stalin actually met in Moscow in October of 1944 and came up what is known as the percentage agreement. Now, they wrote this out on a napkin. They did not include Roosevelt. They didn't even tell any of Roosevelt's advisors that they were actually coming together. And on this napkin, they figured out how much influence they would have in certain countries, particularly over here in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. So Russia would get 90% influence in Romania and 10% to all the other countries like the United Kingdom, United States, if they're interested. Greece, United Kingdom gets 90%. So Great Britain gets 90% influence. And then they had the audacity to throw in there, in accord with the United States. Now, this is going to be a problem a little later on because the Great Britain is going to run into some troubles in Greece and they're going to pull the United States into it. The US isn't even here to agree to this, yet they've included us in this mess that's going to erupt. Russia gets 10% influence. And that 10%, they're going to use that influence with the rise of communism in Greece, and it's going to suck us in. Yugoslavia, they've agreed 50-50. Well, they haven't talked to Tito because Tito's going to tell both of them, get out of Yugoslavia. Hungary, 50-50. They're going to split their influence. And then in Bulgaria, Russia gets 75% and everyone else can have the 25% left. So when you look at this percentage agreement where Stalin and Churchill have pretty much divvied up how they're going to influence the people and the government in these regions, it is no wonder we're going to see conflict between the East and the West. And then they couldn't agree on who was going to keep the napkin. No one wanted it. No one wanted proof of what these two had put together. Here we have, he suggested to Stalin that he should burn it. And he was like, no, you keep it. I'm not taking that thing. So they knew what they were doing was wrong. And they knew that it was going to cause conflict between them. And Churchill is going to manipulate the United States every step of the way. So let's move on to Yalta. At Yalta, we still have our big three. We have Churchill, we have Stalin, and we have Roosevelt, FDR. And here at Yalta in February of 1945, Stalin agreed to hold free elections in Eastern Europe. Okay, he has agreed to hold free elections. And as we see a little later, we really didn't define what we meant as free elections because he has a little thing called salami tactics. And we'll talk about his salami tactics a little later. But hey, we didn't really define what he should do. The United Nations holds its first meeting in April of 1945, and it's held here in the United States. And if you notice, I didn't break down every single part of the United Nations, but this particular part is crucial. The members of the Security Council, the permanent members, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union are definitely in. We pulled France in too, out of respect for the role that France has always played, although France, we know, was pretty much conquered and just wiped out at the beginning of World War II. But we needed a nation in Asia. And actually, the Soviet Union, Stalin was saying, hey, we cover 2 continents. Why not let us represent Asia and Europe? And the United States and Great Britain were not going to have any part of the Soviet Union representing 2 continents. So they went to China. And we're not going to go to Japan because in April of 1945, we are still at war with Japan in World War II. So China is brought in because at the Cairo Declaration, the Cairo Conference, we had worked with Jiang Jiechi, the leader of the national government in China. So bringing them in, we had that representative for Asia. Now, as the permanent members of the Security Council, each and every one of these countries holds the power to veto. And if they veto something that was brought before the Security Council, then it's dead in the water within the Security Council. You might want to try to send it somewhere else in the United Nations to try to get it passed in that area, but within the Security Council, that's it. And each of these countries will use that power of veto throughout the Cold War to manipulate and to destroy each other. And not all of them are going to use it for good. Now, a problem we're going to run into with China. At this moment during World War II, China has not fallen to communism. There was a civil war before World War II had erupted, But when Japan invaded, that civil war was put pretty much on hold. The communists and the nationalist government pretty much were going to have to work together because now they have a common enemy of Japan. But when World War II ends, that civil war erupts again. And the group that's going to win that civil war will be the communists. And then it becomes an issue, are we going to allow China to stay on the board? Because then it becomes the nationalist government will move to Taiwan and Mao and the communists will control mainland China. The United States will want to recognize that the Taiwan government, nationalist government in Taiwan, should be the one on the Security Council. And the Soviet Union is going to say, absolutely not. Mao won the Civil War. Communist China, mainland China, should be that representative. And the US and the Soviet Union will butt heads over that. And that butting of heads will get the United Nations and the US to send troops into Korea. So let's move further into this Yalta conference. They agree that Germany will be divided into 4 occupied zones, as if this was not going to be a headache down the road. I don't know what they were thinking, but this is what they did. So I included here a map. Oops, I went past the map. Back to the map. So Germany is going to be divided. So here we have Germany, what they decided Germany was going to be. Now, VE Day isn't until May 8th, 1945. So they're making these decisions in April. In the earlier part of 1945, the UN met in April. So they've decided how they're going to split up Germany. You have the Soviet zone here. You have the British zone, the French zone, and then the US. Now, this little spot here is Berlin. Now I'm going to look over here where we've enlarged Berlin. Berlin, too, will be split into 4 occupied zones, a French, a British, a US, and the Soviet zone. Notice that Berlin is right here in the Soviet zone. This is going to explode. Actually, 3 years after World War II ends, we are going to be on the verge of another war where one of us has access to nuclear weapons. How far are we really going to take this? Moving on to the rest of the decisions made at Yalta, Poland was to be a coalition government of communists and non-communists, and this was going back and forth. Churchill was very adamant that no communists should be a part of the government in Poland whatsoever. Stalin was adamant that communists need to be included. And again, Roosevelt played that mediator. Let's have a coalition. Let's have both groups and let's get them to work together to represent both sides. There was a letter that Roosevelt wrote to Stalin and said, I understand the position that you are in. I am not going to agree to anything that would make your nation feel threatened by a government along your border. So let's work more toward a coalition government. And they also agreed that the territory that the Soviet Union had pre-1939 was theirs to keep. They didn't have to give anything up. Well, they're really not going to give anything up when we get to the end here. So now we are at Potsdam, July 1945. So Germany has been defeated, and now our focus needs to be on Japan. Well, if we look here, we have some new members of the Big Three. Unfortunately, President Roosevelt has passed away. So his vice president, who is now President Harry S. Truman, is attending Potsdam. Churchill did fly over to Potsdam, but the elections that were happening in England at the time, his party lost, which means he is no longer prime minister. And so their new prime minister, Clement Attlee, is now heading over to Potsdam. So literally, Churchill gets there, has to take his suitcase and head back home, and a new prime minister comes. And now Stalin is sitting here with the newbies. Oh, yeah. They weren't a part of any of the discussions or any of the decisions that were made prior to July of 1945. Yep, we will continue with focusing on Japan. Stalin is still going to help with Japan, and they've agreed they are going to issue the warning of unconditional surrender, or Japan is to face utter devastation. And I notice in some of your responses on the atomic bomb, some of you have suggested that maybe Japan really should have been warned about what that really meant. Because we did test a bomb. We knew there was going to be some devastation. We didn't know how extreme that devastation was because the bomb that we had used in the test was not of the magnitude of the two that we dropped later on in the summer of 1945. Stalin then tells them that the decisions that were made in Eastern Europe, the free elections, yep, that's not happening. Not one bit. We've got the newbies, Truman and Attlee, and he just point out and said, no, not happening. Truman had a response to him. He explained to him that he was not Roosevelt. So he, as president of the United States, would not be kissing Stalin's ass. So when we say free elections in Eastern Europe, there will be free elections in Eastern Europe because Truman now has some information that no one else at the table has. The United States is the only country sitting in that room that has an atomic weapon, and Stalin does not have that. And it's at this conference that they actually do reveal that we have this. And Stalin is furious. How dare Roosevelt keep that information? And then how dare Truman tell in Great Britain before they even share it with the Soviet Union? So Stalin is furious and he demands that before any bomb is ever dropped, it has to be a joint discussion and they all have to agree. Well, they decide what should be done within Germany with the war crimes trials at Nuremberg, where there can be nothing associated with the Nazi Party and it needs to be demilitarized. Well, Truman, as he gets on the plane to leave Potsdam, gives the order, we're dropping the bomb. And when you look at those dates of the dropping of the bomb, we have two. We have the first one on August 6, 1945 in Hiroshima. And then August 9th, 3 days later, we dropped the second one on Nagasaki. Now, Stalin felt that this was a threat. For some people, they say, okay, that first one, understandable. It was saving American lives. Sending troops in, what would that have done? But for Stalin, when you look at the dates, these bombs were dropped within just days of his troops going in. And that was an agreed upon date between the United States and the Soviet Union. And they felt that, that first bomb, okay, saving American lives, that second bomb may have been a warning to the Soviet Union. Do not play with us. We are not going to take any mess from you. So we look at what happened to Europe from this war. They're in ruins. You have millions who are homeless, millions who are relocated. What's going to happen? What's going to go on? And a lot of things. You have Eastern Europe that have been liberated from the Soviet Union. And they aren't treating the people any better than Nazi Germany had done. You have Jewish people who are now being freed from concentration camps. Where do they go? Their homes were destroyed. Things were confiscated. And they're not welcomed in the Soviet Union. They're still not welcome back home. And many are going to head to Palestine, where they're going to try to create a Jewish homeland, which will one day become Israel. You have many European cities that are destroyed and are going to take years to rebuild economically. And the Allied powers, and one of those powers, the United States, is going to make the German people start to clean up their cities and are pretty much going to enslave them to do so. Nazi leaders will be tried and found guilty of war crimes, at least the ones who are captured and didn't flee to the United States or Argentina and other places in South America. And some of those people are still being found today in their 90s, and they're being sent over to The Hague to be tried for crimes against humanity. You saw that women played a larger role in the war economy than they did in World War I. And this time around, women are not going to be as willing to head back home and take on that domestic traditional role. And the two things that are going to really set the tone for what's going to happen from here on are the two superpowers. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two dominating powers, the superpowers. Now, for Great Britain, in order to get our assistance prior to us joining into this war, they had to hand over all of their trade routes to us if they wanted our help. And this is way before even the attack on Pearl Harbor. So this time around in World War II, we were asking for something in return. Where in World War I, we just wanted the loans repaid. But this time around, no. If we're going to step in, it's going to be where we gain. So we have two huge powers at the end. But within those superpowers, right after this war, it's the United States who will be the dominating force because we are the only ones who have that atomic weapon. Okay, so we're going to stop here with the conferences, and then we're going to look at some things that happen right after World War II. That goes straight into the Cold War.